Okay. Sorry, I just used a different, never mind. Anyway. I used a different button to share on my other screen and it got very confusing. So, all right, here we go. Everybody good to see this? Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Barb. Okay. So we are going to talk about private schools and proportionate share. I'm very happy to have Cynthia here from our data team. She is a great help. So if you guys have proportionate share questions, a lot of times we will enlist our data team to help with that. Otherwise, when it comes to uses or kind of the implementation of how you work with private schools, you'll work with RMO, kind of our RMO rather than data team side of things. So we can start with the some general information. So LEAs must expend a proportionate share of IDA funds on equitable services for parentally placed private school children with disabilities. And this is different than students who are placed by the district in a private school. So this would be a situation where the LEA has the resources and has the ability to provide services for a student, and the parent chooses to put them in private school. So if that's the case, you have a PPPS student in your district, they are not going to have the entitlement to the individual services in the same way that a kid in public school would. Instead, your responsibility as the LEA is just spend the proportion amount on their funds to provide equitable services. So if you have 3 kids who are in a who are parentally placed in a private school, you're required to spend that proportionate amount of money. So that would be like 3 students worth, kind of a per pupil, 3 students worth of funding to the private school. And then you don't have to provide the exact services. Like if one kid needed an SLP and one kid needed a nurse, you don't have to provide those exact individual services. It would be, how do we take this pot of money that we have to provide services, the best use of services in that school? So when we talk about kind of that per pupil, that the amount of funding that you need to expend when you're talking about kids in private school, we have a special little formula we do to get that. So over there on the left, we take your total federal flow through. So that would be your district's total award. Then we divide that by the number of IDA eligible public and private school kids. So that would be everybody in your district who is eligible for IDEA services. And then we would multiply that by the number of children who are in the private school. So, you know, you have a award of $100, you have 5 kids total, you're going to get 20. I am doing math on the fly here. This is bold of me. See, then you get your $20 a student. Say one of those kids is in a parentally private school, then your proportionate share for that student to expend on in that private school would be just that $20. So one of the requirements for a district when spending your proportionate share, before you get to that point, you're required to have a consultation meeting with private school officials and representative of the parents to determine and to explain kind of how the proportionate share is calculated. We put that, you know, the district would explain that to the parents, potentially the private school. If you needed any assistance with that, we are more than happy to help you out, providing resources or being a part of that meeting in any way if necessary. You'd want to talk about the total amount of funding that's available across the district, and then how funds are going to be used if they're insufficient to serve all students. And then finally, we would talk about your allowable uses as well, which would be for direct services or indirect services, keeping in mind that child find and evaluation costs are not allowable uses for parentally placed private school kids. So the responsibility to identify students, it does not count in your parentally placed private school dollars, don't go toward that evaluation. So just kind of a note on child find there that each district must, locate, identify, and evaluate students with disabilities that are enrolled in private schools, including religious private schools, if these students are within the boundaries of your district. There is a distinction between the child find activities for parentally placed students and the obligation to use that amount of money. So like we said earlier, the obligation to conduct child find services or to conduct child find exists separately from your equitable services. And so it is the LEA's responsibility to spend the appropriate amount on private school students. But the cost of child find does not count toward that amount. Erica, I see your hand up. Do you want to ask your question now?
Yeah. Hey, Thea. I've had requests, and it seems to come up a couple of times a year around like hearing and vision screenings, and they aren't necessarily connected to child find. They're just like, hey, I want to have, my kids participate or like have us just not even participate in like our annual health screenings. But just, months later, an email from a parent who's like, hey, my kid, we live within, so there's like a couple of things. They live in our district, but their kid attends a private school that is not in our boundaries. Like their private school is in a different district's boundaries. But I guess my question is, if it is not connected to, I think my kid has, let's say, a hearing impairment that is, a child find obligation, but they're like, hey, will you check my kid's hearing? Where does that fall within our child find obligation for a parentally placed private school student? Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. So you've got a student who lives within your district. They attend a private school outside of the district, and the parent is requesting not an evaluation, but just requesting like you to kind of check out their hearing. Is that
right? But let's say even if the private school was within my district, if it's not related to, I think my kid has a disability, if it's just like, hey, will you check it? Right?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to want a minute to think about that a little bit more.
Sure.
But so I will get back to you. But my first thought would be that if it's not related to a disability, and it wouldn't be kind of fall within your typical evaluation for like a hearing impairment, that would not be the responsibility. But like I said, I'm going to do a little bit of research on that and then I'll get back to you.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Great question.
And sorry, before we move on, Erica, do you mind putting your email address in the chat so we can get back to you on the question? That'd be great.
Of course. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so then beyond the child find requirement, there are a few other requirements. One of those is a written affirmation, also a complaint, so the LEA must obtain a written affirmation from your private school and your parent representatives, anybody who was a part of that consultation process, that affirms that a timely and meaningful consultation has occurred. So if the private school officials or the parents think that the consultation was either not timely or it wasn't meaningful in a way that, for example, the LEA didn't take into consideration all the things that the private school was asking for and needing, then the private school officials and parents have the right to complain to the SEA. So it could be something where, a private school, just because they request specific services be provided doesn't necessarily mean that the LEA is going to agree to that, whether it's because of the amount of funding or, the kind of other factors. So a complaint wouldn't be that we didn't get our way. A complaint would be, the consultation wasn't actually meaningful, that like the LEA had made up their mind before they even came to the table. So they, we weren't taken into consideration. And if there is a private school or an LEA, if you are kind of managing a situation like this, the private school, they would come, the complaint that they would file would be with us as the SEA. So we would be there to kind of help facilitate and see, work together on that. And then another requirement is the data collection and record keeping. So LEAs have to, collect your information about your number of students who are evaluated, your number of students who are determined to be children with disabilities, and then the number of students who are actually served. For preschool requirements, so that would be, children with disabilities age 3 to 5, if they are enrolled by their parents, they're considered to be parentally placed if the school or daycare program meets the definition of elementary school. Because there are some, students who will be enrolled in programs that wouldn't be considered parentally placed if that program doesn't meet this definition. So Part B, it's defined as a nonprofit institutional day or residential school that includes public elementary charter schools that provide elementary education as determined under state law. So then that last part there, determined under state law, we don't have that Oregon regulation in here. But if you had a question about whether the school that a child was attending qualified or not, reach out to us and we would figure that out together as well. So and then that final note there, that if a child with a disability is enrolled in some sort of program that doesn't meet the definition of elementary school, that child would not be eligible for the equitable services, but the state's obligation to make FAPE available remains. So even if they are not eligible for equitable services, we still have to provide them FAPE. And that is kind of a fiscal differentiation there, that the equitable services is what's provided by IDEA dollars, but FAPE is a requirement that goes beyond just IDEA fiscal or dollars. The transportation requirements are a little bit different for parentally placed students. So if they need to participate in services, you have to provide transportation from either the school or the home to the site, and then from the site to, the home or the school, depending on where it's at. But our LEAs are not required to provide transportation from the home to the school. The transportation is related to the services and not the school, like the location of the private school. So whether the services, fall in the beginning of the day where, a student could be picked up from their home, taken to their service, and then taken back to the school, assuming that their school day continues on site. In that case, that would be a reason that a student would get transportation to the school, but it would be because of the timing of the service, and that the transportation is actually related to the service, not just getting to school. So here's kind of some notes about what equitable services mean. So these are special education and related services, including direct services that are provided to the students in accordance with IDEA. So like we talked about, a child with a disability is not entitled to that individual service. It is in the same way that they would be if they were attending a public school, or if the child was placed in a private school by the school district. So that would be a scenario where, maybe a private school offers a specific support that the district public schools can't. So in that case, the district decides that the IEP team decides that the best way for this child to get their education is to attend this private school, then that is not considered a parentally placed private school child. And in that case, that student would still be entitled to the individual services that they would receive at a public school. So IDEA does not prohibit you from using additional state and local funds to provide special ed services to children with disabilities, parentally placed children with disabilities. If there was a student or, more than one at a school who needed services, you could use additional state and local dollars to provide those individual services rather than just the equitable services if the LEA chose to do that. And as long as the LEA is meeting all of the other requirements of IDEA, including providing FAPE to all of your children in public schools, then you are allowed to spend more IDEA dollars than just that proportionate amount. So you are always allowed to use additional state and local dollars. And as long as you are meeting all of the LEA or IDEA requirements in your public schools, you're also allowed to use additional IDEA funds. And then the state and local funds may supplement, but not supplant your proportionate amount. So same thing with the actual services that you're providing to students, the supplement, not supplant rule also applies to the amount of dollars that are going to students in these private schools. And there we are at the end. We will shut the recording down. If you guys have any other questions,